Tonight you will be taking notes on the design process. Hopefully this is a review for everybody. This is also known as the scientific method. It is now called the design process. First thing we need to do is we need to know the steps of the design process. Yes, you need to know the steps, and yes, they need to be in order. So the first step is observation. So most of the time when you think of observation, you think of what can you see. But remember, it can also be what do you feel, what do you hear, what do you taste, what do you smell. With observations, you could also just be identifying a problem if given a situation. Just depends on what you are given or what is in front of you. From this observation, you will be forming a question. This question is known as our hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is going to be something that you use to explain this problem or observation, and you have to be able to test it, which means you have to be able to create an experiment. Now, this hypothesis can be stated as a question, but it should be stated for us in if, then, because format. So, for example, if I water my plant, then it will grow because it has what it needs to grow, and water is what causes it to grow. Okay, it's very important that you have that if, that then, and definitely that because. We need to know the explanation as to why you chose your hypothesis. From your hypothesis, you will need to test it or experiment. So experiment is our next step. This is to see if your hypothesis is correct. Once you get your data, you then need to analyze it. That means you're looking at it. You're figuring out what does this data actually tell me? And once you figure that out, you have your conclusion or you conclude. So you summarize what all of that data told you, and you need to bring that back to your hypothesis. Was your hypothesis right? Was it wrong? Do you need to retest? That is what the design process is, or the scientific method. So you have observation, hypothesis, experiment, analyze, and conclude. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a good way to remember this. This is called a mnemonic device, and this is for the design process. I have Oscar hates eating apple chips. So the O is for observation, H, hypothesis, E, experiment, A, analyze, and C for conclude or conclusion. This is a good way if on a quiz or a test you're struggling to remember the order or what the words are. Just think back, Oscar hates eating apple chips. So let's look at the design process in more of a flowchart format. Once again, the very first thing you have to do is make observations. Once again, you can kind of think of a question or try and figure out what the problem is, but to do this, you have to make these observations. You then need to figure out what the question is that you want to ask. Now, sometimes if you aren't given an experiment, you might have to do this next step, which is figure out some background research. What is already known about this? What do you want to know? But typically you can skip that step. So you will make your observations, you will ask that question, and then you will need to turn that question into a hypothesis. Remember, if, then, because format. You have your hypothesis. You then need to test it. So you have an experiment, you test out, is your hypothesis right or wrong? You get your data, you then need to analyze it, figure out what does that data tell you, and then you can draw a conclusion. Now from here, there are multiple steps that you may need to take. First, you have to determine, is your hypothesis true or is it false? Maybe it's just partially true. If your hypothesis is true, or if your hypothesis is partially true, then you can just report your results in the form of a lab report. However, in the real world, if your hypothesis was completely incorrect or false, you would have to then go back to your hypothesis, think of something different, figure out what you needed to change, and then retest it and figure out what your conclusion would be. You would continue this process until you either completely prove something was false or completely true. You would need to have multiple experiments over and over again to figure out, is my hypothesis correct, incorrect, and then why. All right, the last slide that we are going to do today is talking about how science uses this design process. So you will see some of the words that we saw in the design process on this slide. First thing, remember, science originates in these questions. When we defined science in class yesterday, we said that it was looking at the natural world and figuring out how or why things happen. So questions are huge in science. So once you figure out this question, or you ask a question, that inquiry or that experimentation, you're going to explore this question to figure out what is the answer. So in order to do this, you must use your observations. So once again, you're going to look around, you're going to hear, you're going to smell, you're going to touch. In some instances, you may need to taste. You take all of those observations and you put them together to come up with this inference. Or remember, this is kind of an educated guess. So you use those observations, bring them together, you figure out what's your inference, and then you can kind of give this explanation to what you have seen. This also kind of goes back to that check activity we did. I gave you all those checks, you observed, you came up with your inference or your story from what your observations were. So this is your design process. Now tomorrow in class we are going to look at observations versus inferences. We'll look at the differences, things that I definitely want to see when you do observations, when you create inferences, and then we'll also look at variables. But this concludes your notes for tonight.